Hey guys, my name is Eric Vento. This is another podcast of Government to Private where we discuss the transition from, in this case, law enforcement to the private sector. With us today is Peter Forcelli or Forcelli, depending on how you want to say it. He left the ATF as an assistant director and now is at a Fortune 50 company leading their regional investigations program. Peter, it's so great to have you with us today.
Good to be here, Eric. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Let's just jump right into it, brother. I know we've been talking a lot. We've known each other for a long time. We've been connected on LinkedIn for a long time. Can you just break it down, your background in federal law enforcement, what you did before ATF, if applicable, and give us some highlights over the course of your career?
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to. Yeah, I actually started my law enforcement career in January of 1987 with the NYPD. Well, actually, let me go back. The New York City Housing Authority Police Department. It was before Giuliani came in. There were three different police departments: the Housing Authority, Transit Authority, and the NYPD. We all took the same test, went to the same academy. I wound up being a housing cop, walked the beat in the projects. Really enjoyed it because you talk to people. You're on your, you're on your feet. You're on your feet. You're walking. It could be the midnight shift. Could be a 4 to 12 shift, day shift. You're alone, so you got to learn how to relate to folks. Eventually, got promoted. Was a detective in housing. Then we all merged into the NYPD. Thanks to Giuliani, we called it the hostile takeover because I really loved being a housing cop. So I wound up originally in the 47th Precinct Detective Squad, which was just a local detective squad. Eventually wound up in the Bronx Homicide Task Force, and I was there for just roughly 5 years. And during that time, we were working quite a bit with ATF and FBI and other feds on racketeering cases. And I really liked the way the ATF folks worked, and I liked the federal sentencing a lot better because it seemed like our work paid off more, where instead of getting plea bargains on murders down to like 4 years, we were putting people away for a really long time that were wreaking havoc in neighborhoods. So eventually, some of the ATF folks talked me into taking the ATF test, took it, left that day. It was supposed to be the day of the Bronx homicide versus Bronx robbery softball game. That test was so hard that when I showed up, people thought I was, because we enjoy some cocktails at the game. People thought I showed up already inebriated. I was just so beaten from that test. So a week later, I got my test results, and I actually thought it was a joke that someone was playing on me because my NYPD test results took like a year to come back. The ATF one took like a week. So anyway, long story short, got hired by ATF in New York, was an agent there for about 6 years. Went to Phoenix as a group supervisor for 5 years. So I was a first line supervisor there, overseeing roughly 10 agents and about 6 Phoenix cops, task force officers, and a couple of marshals, and an HSI agent we work with a lot. And I also had oversight over our Yuma office. 5 years into that, left, went to headquarters for a really short stint, went up to Canada for 2 years as a liaison. Canadian cops are some of the best people on the planet. Old school, man, just like the cops I work with in the 80s. But that was like 2012 to 14. So I did 2 years there. Went back to headquarters for a year. I was the head of ATF's leadership and professional development division. So like all the leadership training, all the advanced training fell under me. Went down to Miami as an assistant special agent in charge, which is like the number 2 of the office. There were some morale issues, which is a great challenge, to go and try to fix an office that was perceived as having been broken a little bit. They had a leader in place there prior to us that was there for like 13 years. So, with leaders, change is good. Someone being in one place too long is not a good thing, I think. So eventually my boss there got promoted, and then I promoted into being the number 1 of the office, which is called the special agent in charge. I was there for the Fort Lauderdale airport shooting and Parkland. We had a couple of hurricanes that hit us, Category 5 hurricanes. So it was a stormy couple of years. I guess they felt bad for Miami and my bad luck. So they brought me back to headquarters, and I wrapped up my last few years as a deputy assistant director. So I originally for all East Coast operations, and then for like the last roughly 3.5 years, I was the head of training for ATF, which was great because by this time I was getting towards the end of my career, 35 years in total, law enforcement, getting burnt out. It was a gift to be able to get on a plane or get in a car and drive down to South Georgia and just, welcome the new agents in and kind of watch their training one week a month. Didn't have to put on a suit down there. I put on 511 pants and a golf shirt, but it was good because seeing those fresh new faces helped recharge my batteries and keep me going. But then I realized I wouldn't have been mandatory till next month. I left just under 2 years ago. I realized it was time to move on, and just really started looking to see what I could do and still feel really useful somewhere.
Absolutely. I know I shouldn't be focusing on this, but you mentioned that you started with the housing department back in January of '87, right?
Yes.
Well, at that point in my life, I was 3 months old.
Wow. That's okay. Well, it's funny because when I was a deputy assistant director at headquarters, I was a lot of the folks that I viewed as my peers started to retire, and they started promoting some younger folks that had I didn't have a degree. So if you had like a JD after you were a rising star. So some of them, I think one was 11 that I eventually had like above me in my chain of command, not my direct supervisor, and one of them was 9. So when I started my law enforcement career, she was 9 years old. And now she was,
Awesome.
so that's just how it goes, man.
That's how it goes, brother. So once you started, figuring out, at least mentally, that you were kind of approaching the end, and you knew that you wanted to start, doing something else, what did that process look like for you? Like, how did you approach the transition?
Well, there were a few things. One is I had spoken to folks who had left before to get some ideas. And it's weird, like, for Secret Service and the FBI, those folks have tremendous networks on the outside. They get into some big companies. And from what I've seen, they tend to look out for one another. ATF doesn't have that sort of network so much. So I was encouraged to do a couple things. One of them was to start going out and meeting folks for coffee or for beers, preferably beers. People get to know you a little bit better. I was also encouraged, to start engaging on LinkedIn, but it was kind of weird. It was actually advice I got from a guy named Tom Joyce, who's also on LinkedIn. He's a former NYPD cold case squad commander, just a really good dude. And he said, look, just to have your profile up. So, if your resume's out there in some company and people see your name, and they might, it might click. So his advice was to post positive stuff, keep it apolitical. I thought I would be applying for things perhaps in leadership development. So a lot of the posts that I posted were specific to like leadership development, things I had seen in my career about leadership, both good and bad, cautionary tales. And it's interesting because I actually did get a lot of back and forth and a lot of folks who wanted to connect. So my network grew to nearly I think it's like 14,000. So it grew by 4,000 people over a year just by posting stuff that related to leadership development, leadership, anecdotes and stuff like that. So it was kind of a two-pronged attack, the meeting people in person and building my network in LinkedIn. And then I started looking, but I was told to start looking really because they kind of hinted that no company that's worth going to work for, and I don't know that this was true, is going to hire you in 2 weeks. Like, it's going to be a process. There's going to be multiple interviews. So I was encouraged to start sending out my resume about 6 months before I was really ready to pull the pin. So I did start doing that, but still took me a lot longer than 6 months to land the job. It was an incredibly humbling experience, and I made some mistakes along the way. Spent a lot of money on a resume by one of those resume companies. I won't name them. I don't want to besmirch them, but it was $600. That resume didn't get so much as one tickle. And I didn't use you. I'll say that. I didn't use your resume service. So, I mean, that was another thing that was kind of a learning experience, is that there's there's an industry out there about, hey, we'll help you find a job. But, you got to be careful who you select and make sure that they actually know what they're talking about and know the industry that you're looking at too,
Absolutely. And that's two things I want to kind of bring up as a result of what you just said. You mentioned the posting. That's probably one of the most common questions I get from people that I talk to on a regular basis is, do I need to post on LinkedIn? And if so, what should I even start with? And what I always tell them is that, no, you don't have to post on LinkedIn, but if you're trying to drive engagement and visibility and start getting your name and your brand out there, then posting is a great way to do it. Mm-hmm. The second aspect of that is, we're all human beings. We all have strong emotions. And at least from a LinkedIn perspective, what I have found is that we really are attracted to authenticity. We're attracted to really good thoughts and people being honest and forthright and asking for help and saying, hey, I really enjoyed this. You guys should check it out. We're not attracted to fluff. We're not attracted to, you know, emotionless sales pitches or anything like that. We really want something that we can believe in. We want something that we can, get attached to. And so some of the best posts that I've ever seen are posts that really draw you in. They get you connected to the story of what they're trying to say, and it makes you invested in the overall post. And those are the ones that by far get the most hits.
Yeah.
And so absolutely agree with you on that. And then, from a resume perspective, that's the drum I beat all day, every day, because there's a ton of resume writers out there. They're a dime a dozen. And if you ask 10 different people to look at a resume, you're going to get 10 different responses. But the one thing that you want to do, especially when you're talking about a field as specialized as law enforcement or even the military, the intelligence community, all these different specialties, you really want someone who understands that background and that environment and can articulate that to the private sector, because, there's plenty of companies out there that can give you a decent resume. But if you ask them, well, explain to me how you would articulate a law enforcement resume to a corporate, that's where you start running into, I would just focus on what you did. Well, what I did doesn't really translate in most cases,
Right.
So, I think you hit the nail, dead on the head there. And,
Well,
that's a learning experience for a lot of people.
yeah. Well, the other thing is I learned the hard way is full disclosure. I had 33 resumes out before I actually got a job with a written offer in hand. Originally, I was just sending out the same resume to different companies. Then I realized, hey, it's probably better to tailor the resume a little bit more to each company. And I'm not saying I didn't, change the names and things like that to the company I was applying to, obviously. So that was one. But the other mistake that I made was, I spent a lot of my time in straight up investigations, and I had some great cases that I had the pleasure of working on with some great people. But then I also spent some time in what would be the HR world, where I was in charge of ATS recruiting and hiring of special agents for a few years. So I was like, wow, that's great. I'll include that. And then training, I'll include that. Well, what I didn't realize is no, you should break those things out depending on which job you're looking at, because they're not looking for a guy that might, or gal that might have all three of those things, unless that's what the job is specifically asking for. So I mean, if I'm applying to an investigative job with a company, they don't care about recruiting and hiring, and they don't care about training. So take it out. You can always bring it up in the job interview. So one of the mistakes that I made early on is thinking that one size fits all with resumes too, with the many different companies that I had applied to. But it was incredibly humbling when you send out resumes. I had a pretty impressive title. It sounds impressive. And I would say of the 33 resumes that I sent out, probably about half of them, I didn't even get a "Hey, thank you for applying" email, which was kind of unusual. I mean, I got the confirmation that they received it, but then it went into like radio silence. Then there were quite a few where it was like, "Well, hey, thanks for applying, but we're going in a different direction, and we'll keep your resume for later." And then there were a couple that led to interviews and whatnot that we could chat if you want about, which were interesting, eye opening.
So you said that it took you about 11 months to get hired from when you started looking, but you only did 33 applications over those 11 months. So it sounds
Yes.
like you were really selective in what you chose to put in for.
Well, I look, the ATF had changed for me. Like the culture had changed a little bit. I was kind of the old dog, even though I'm not really that old. And I didn't feel like I was fitting in the way I did years earlier. So I didn't want to leave bitter or angry, and I wasn't. That's not how I left. But at the same time, I had a great job. So it wasn't like I was in a hurry to go. I wasn't being forced out the door. I know some folks, and I know I'm here to talk about my experience. I know quite a few people who retired and said, I'm going to take a year off and then I'm going to go find a job. For each and every one of them, it was a bear to get a job, because I think they were looked at as like, well, why aren't you working now? Like, so, I mean, my advice, and I'm not here to steal your thunder, would be don't quit a job unless you absolutely have to, and look for a job while you're working. But I only applied to 33 because I still had a job and I was being somewhat selective. So you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that we all have different situations, and I think what I would agree with is that if at all possible, keep your job while you look for a new one. Because, as I tell a lot of the clients and the people that I meet with on a daily basis, with the job market being the way it is, you're looking at 6 to 9 months,
Yeah.
to find a job in today's market. And that's if you're doing everything the right way, meaning tailoring your resume, networking, asking for referrals, because looking for a job is a job. And I know that's like probably like one of the most overused phrases in the English language right now, but it's extremely true. And you can get really depressed and down about all the rejections and all the applications that you're putting in with limited to no results to show for it. But what I tell people is at the end of the day, all you're looking for is one yes. You're looking for someone to give you a chance to get you to the interview stage and give you a chance to sell yourself. And you ended up working for, one of the biggest employers on the planet. So can you talk to us a little bit about, how that position came into your lap?
Well, yeah. I had applied to several jobs at Amazon. I applied to jobs at other companies. I was actually 6 or 7 interviews in with another company that deals with gunshot technology. And I had interviewed with another company that dealt with training, that was told I would be getting a job. And then I found out the job was contingent upon a contract. The company didn't tell me that. I found out from the government organization later on. It was contingent upon a contract that they never got. So I was a little disingenuous with the job offer. But so I had applied to several jobs at Amazon. Didn't hear anything back for a couple of them. I did get one offer for a job up in Maryland, but it was quite a commute, and the pay wasn't as good as I felt I could have gotten. So I was several interviews in with that gunshot technology company, and what happened was a year earlier I had gone out to a ATF training exercise called Ravens Challenge in Arizona, and I ran into a former colleague that was working at Amazon, and he had sent my resume to a manager in Amazon saying, "Hey, you really should consider this guy." And so I got a phone call from the manager saying, "Hey, are you still looking for a job?" And I was like, "Yeah." Well, what I didn't realize is that person not only did he send the manager my resume, he applied for me. What was Well, what became a little bit embarrassing was the job posting actually required a bachelor's degree, and I have a ton of training. I've been through college courses, and if you added up all of the credits, I probably would have a bachelor's degree, maybe a little more, but I don't have a degree. So I was embarrassed, and I had to reach out to this manager saying, "Hey, listen, sorry, but um, yeah, I'm interested in a job, but I'm not going to waste your time because I'm not qualified." And he was a great guy. He's like, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "I don't have a degree." And he's like, "Well, I think his mom was a professor and his brothers." So I'm like, "Oh boy, here it comes." Like he's not going to be too thrilled with me. But I didn't send in the resume. And lo and behold, we had a great conversation for probably about an hour. And then he's like, "Well, I'll get back to you." And then there was a couple of weeks had passed, and he's like, "Well, now we're going to do an official phone screen." And we had a really good conversation, which led to at Amazon they do these hiring process called loops, which is 5 or 6 interviews in one day. Each is about 50 minutes long. It is brutal, and they really get into, like, if you're going to take credit for something, you better be damn ready to explain not just what you accomplished, but how you did it, what you did it, what was the data behind it. So it was rough, which was a big change for me because in government, each promotion was a panel interview where you sit there with 3 people at once and they'll pepper you with questions. And then, an hour later you walk out and you're like, okay, well, this was 6 different interviews over the course of one day. And, you're at the end of the day, man, you're just beaten down. So I was thrilled when he reached back and said, "Hey, are you still interested? Because our HR people are going to reach out to you." And that's how I wound up here. But it's funny because the gunshot technology company was a little bit upset because they're like, "Hey, we had one more interview that we wanted to do with you in a couple of weeks," and they were great people. But I was like, "Hey, you guys bird in hand, man." And I love it so far. It's been the biggest transition for me has been being a deputy assistant director in ATF headquarters. If I went into the office, I had to wear a suit. There was no not going in a suit, even if I was meeting with nobody, even if I was just going in to sign contracts or whatever. Suit. At Amazon, it's much more relaxed. I've worn a suit to funerals and to, stuff like that. So that's been it's been an interesting transition to being comfortable to go to work this way. But it's certainly welcome. My dry cleaning bill is almost non-existent now.
That's what I love to hear. You bring up the loops, and the loops are something that are pretty unique to the big tech world. I mean, no matter where you apply, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and I've applied and interviewed at most of them. Every single one of them has a loop, and for anyone who is applying in the big tech world, that's something that you need to prepare for.
Yes.
Because it's not something that you can just guess your way through or just kind of stumble through, because at least at Amazon, you want to talk about bar raisers, and all the different nuances that each company has in regards to that specific person. But it's very much a focus on not only are you qualified to do the job, but are you a good culture fit? Every single company in the big tech world has leadership principles and cultures and very, very, specific aspects of the company that they integrate into their hiring process that you are expected to become an expert in, and you are expected to relate your experience to those principles during the hiring process. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle, is, and that's what I tell people all the time is, you not only have to articulate your experience on paper, but you also have to be able to articulate that in an interview setting, and, if, for example, if you're interviewing for Amazon and you have to, become familiar with Amazon's leadership principles, which are all over the internet, by the way, it's not a secret or anything, but you do have to be able to give concise examples of how they line up to each principle. And you get asked those whether you're applying for a people management role or an individual contributor role, and so understanding the nuances of the interview processes at these different companies that you're looking at is extremely important to succeeding in any type of role.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And look, I'm not here to speak on behalf of Amazon. I don't have permission to do that. But you're right. I mean, they have 16 leadership principles. They do expect you to articulate some of them in an interview, and they expect you to live by them while you're working too. I mean, that's one thing I'll say about the private sector that I loved my time in government, 35 years in government. There's in government, you don't have to work very hard and you can survive. And look, I think the private sector knows that. So I think they look at cops a little harder. As civil servants in some parts of the country and in federal government, it's almost impossible to get fired. So I think that when you're going into these companies where performance matters, they're looking at you a little harder. So you need to work a little harder to prove that you're willing to get your hands dirty. And that was another thing that I had spoken to some other executives from federal service that went out, and one of them, Derek Maltz, he's former DEA head of their special operations division. He gave me great advice. He goes, Pete, in the private sector, he said, some of these companies have caught on. The guy was a senior executive service employee, which is like a level within the government that you have to get blessed off on by the OPM. And then obviously you have military officers that get blessed off by Congress. You have a staff. You're not doing the work anymore. You have a team that's doing things for you. And what he was telling me, and I believe him, is the private sector, other than these big defense contractors who still may or may not hire those folks, they might not want you because you haven't gotten your hands dirty in a long time. You don't do the work. You have a team that does it for you. And in fact, you can't even turn on the coffee pot because someone's making coffee for you in the office. And so, I mean, I think if you're at a higher level or a command level person looking for a job, and I know some of the people watching might be, is you need to be prepared to be able to articulate why you're still willing to get your hands dirty. And you might not be going into a corporate job at the same level or even close to the same level as what you left in government or in law enforcement.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we should really at least briefly talk about is job titles and job descriptions in the private sector are super inconsistent. And so in the government world, at least from a USA jobs perspective, you look at a job, you know exactly what you're going into. You know what the grade is, you know what the salary range is, you know who your boss is, you know what the general expectations of the position are. There's no surprises for the most part. And in the private sector, I may have this example all the time. You could be a director of security for Allied Universal, overseeing a strip mall, making 80 grand a year, and then be a director of security somewhere else and have regional responsibility pulling down 250 a year. Same job title, significantly different scope and complexity.
Right.
And so I think that's also one of the frustrations that people run into with the private sector. But at the end of the day, if you're tailoring your resume appropriately, what you're called really doesn't matter all that much. Now, our job title is still important, absolutely. But what really drives like total compensation and expectations are what you're responsible for in your own individual job description.
Yeah. And that's another thing that is like, it was because I was proud of some of the things I accomplished, certain cases and whatnot, certain incidents I had handled. And in the law enforcement world, that makes for great bar tales, right? Makes for great conversation, but it doesn't translate into what you're doing in the private sector, like a mass shooting, for example. It's very limited, like handling the Parkland shooting, for example, was all right, something that was challenging. Sad at the same time, obviously. A lot of moving parts, a lot of coordination. Translating that kind of experience into the corporate world is not an easy thing. Whereas, managing a budget, because when I was in charge of training, we had a budget of roughly like $30 million. That does translate into some of the stuff that you might do in the private sector. So the things that I think cops are most prideful of, and agents and whatnot, often don't matter in the private sector, like being in a shooting or saving someone from a burning car. Got a medal for this. Well, that's great, but we don't do that here. So
Yeah, and
proud
that's
of you,
that's one
but
that's one thing that I just love to do with people is try to translate that, because when I hear about saving someone from a burning car or responding to an active shooter, I automatically think, okay, emergency response, crisis management, business continuity, disaster recovery. I think about, event planning. I think about physical security. I think about threat assessments. And my mind just goes everywhere, but I think it's also a matter of perspective, because, I have had the privilege of being involved in multiple different programs at multiple major companies over the years, and having been involved in, project management and program management and global crisis management and investigations and all these different buckets, if you will, under the overall corporate security umbrella, in my opinion, at least, allows me to see those instances that we have in law enforcement that are considered just part of the job, the day-to-day responsibilities, especially in patrol, that are immediately correlatable to the private sector. They're just in a different language,
right.
And so you've been in a critical incident, you've been in a shooting, you've responded to an active shooter. Those are examples that most people will never experience in their entire lifetime. And the mental fortitude that it gives you to stay calm in a high pressure situation and to utilize de-escalation and active listening and, critical response, those are skills that are very much in demand in certain aspects of the private sector. But being able to articulate that is absolutely critical. But the need and the need for those services absolutely does exist.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I'll tell you something else that's been real. It's been comforting. Again, for me, the big transition was leaving government, where you have that sense of security. In the corporate world, if they decide, hey, man, the stock value is down, we need to dump some bodies. It's not like that where, hey, I'm just going to stick around till retirement, and even if I suck, they're going to keep me. That's not how it works. But what I have found is the decisiveness, the ability that you have to communicate with people. Because you're dealing with people, if you're a cop, in times of crisis, at their worst times, you're still able to talk to them, to comfort them, to get through that. You're able to de-escalate situations. You're able to have difficult conversations. those are really valuable once you get that transition done and you're in the corporate world. So one thing I'll say is, I mean, for those who are looking to move on, is once you get to an organization, you may be surrounded by PhDs and scientists and all kinds of crazy geniuses, and I say crazy in an endearing way, which is my situation. Like people far, far, far smarter than me, yet they still really appreciate the skills that you bring to the table. Like I've been surprised to see how much respect I get from people from various different parts of the corporation, um, because of how I communicate with them or what I know or what I can deliver for them. So I just say that it's important, even though you're transitioning into the corporate world, to not you don't want to be too, I guess, egotistical and think, all right, I got this and I'll land any job I want, because it's not easy and it's humbling to find a job. But once you get in there, it's not that difficult to prove yourself if you're genuine and you've actually done the job, in law enforcement, and you've built relationships and you've done things. Your skills will be valued once you show up in a corporate site somewhere, and you show them what you're made of.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's just a great point. I really appreciate you bringing that up. What has been one of the most surprising things that you've encountered since being in the private sector, Pete?
Well, I wouldn't say it's been surprising, because there's definitely a need to produce, like in government and in a lot of police departments. And I'm not saying it's always the case. If you're breathing, you're not out there committing a crime or doing something completely stupid, hey, you're doing a great job. Here, they really expect you to deliver. But I kind of expected that. The relaxed dress code in the tech world is been a little bit surprising. Um, you know, eh, the other thing is, in the government, everybody has their own office, everybody has their own desk. I noticed that, like in a lot of corporations now, they've gone to this agile seating, or I know friends that are working in similar companies where you call up and you book in a room, almost like those, what are they, Regis offices, where you just, all right, I'm taking this office for the day, I'm
Like
going to
we
reserve
work?
it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's been interesting to try to absorb, and I get it. It's it's business. That's how they do business, and there's financial aspects to it. But when you come from a place where you show up at a facility every day, or you're pushing a patrol car every day, it's like kind of the same thing. There's routine. Here, it's a lot of it's just every day's a little bit different because of the dynamics of how the company is structured.
Yeah. That's definitely a perk that I really enjoy. I work 100% remote. I have for almost 5 years. And, although there are some cons to working remotely, overall, it's been just a massive blessing. And, of course, being able to wear, shorts and t-shirts, you know, and, or, something a little bit more formal, but far less formal than a suit and tie,
Yeah.
is pretty fantastic. Not having to commute into the office and waste gas and deal with road rage, angry drivers and stuff like that has been pretty great as well. But I think it's been at least from my perspective, the transition out of law enforcement was really difficult, since it was involuntary, and I've talked a lot about that over the years. But man, the impact that moving to the private sector has had on my family and my mental health is just been over and above amazing.
Yeah. Good.
So
Well, that's one thing I will say, because you bring it up. I didn't think of it earlier. The one thing that I would say that you can't replicate, and I maybe shouldn't say can't, but it's almost impossible to replicate when you're working in a profession where you're in harm's way with other people routinely. There's a camaraderie. I will never try to say what law enforcement does is the same as the military. I never spent time in a fob in the mountains of Afghanistan or anything like that. But there's a camaraderie that comes along with folks that do that sort of thing that you can't replicate anywhere else. In law enforcement, I would say the same thing. And the reason I say it is because in New York, we had A, B, and C houses. And the A houses were like the 46th precinct, the 44th precinct. It's a grind. You're answering like 30, 40 radio calls a day. And that's not an exaggeration. So, I mean, those folks were tight. Then you had your quieter precincts, and that's where like the kind of Peyton play stuff was going on, who's sleeping with who, everybody hated each other. Um, but there was the camaraderie in law enforcement that's, I think, the one thing that a lot of folks that make the transition miss. And I still get together with my former ATF friends. We meet for beers or whatever, talk, solve the problems of the world. But and NYPD had a saying, and I use it. I put it on LinkedIn a few times. Is I don't miss the circus, but I really miss the clowns. And it's because the camaraderie that you have when you're working in the law enforcement profession is really tough to beat. So that's, I have a great team I work with. I love them. They're good people, but we're spread out, and and the kind of the nature of the work we do it's not as dangerous. Sort of that same sense of sacrifice, even though they're great people, isn't there. So, I mean, if you're looking to replicate that when you leave, that's going to be a hard thing to adjust to,
Yeah.
is to not have that. And then the other thing is, out in the private sector, man, a lot of the joking around that we do in law enforcement, it is not welcome in the private sector. It is just,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a lot more
Yeah.
delicate folks in the least corporate spaces than there are in precinct houses and firehouses.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, that's something that I ran smack dab in the middle of when I transitioned out and I worked at Capital One. Was, I was, that was almost 10 years ago. And, I was trying to find my place. I was trying to fit in, I was trying to figure out how to assimilate successfully into this bizarre, strange world. And there were quite a few things I said that I probably shouldn't have said. And my boss at the time was a former FBI ASAC. And he kind of just took me aside and he said, "Hey man, you can't say that stuff. You're not with people who, you've kicked down doors with and run search warrants with, who, you know, are talking the exact same language. Like most of your peers here are people who don't have any idea what your background is. They're people who are coming straight out of college, and he's like, you have to know your audience,
Right.
And he's like, I understand what you're trying to do and I empathize, but this is a whole new world, and it's far easier to have an HR complaint raised against you, or any number of other scenarios, just based on pure perception of what you said.
Yeah. No, that's good advice. So that's a little of adjustment too. 'Cause look, in my previous career, I was always a bit of a wise ass. Luckily, I got a great boss who I think he kind of chuckles sometimes, but I dial it back a lot. But we have a good time at work. Good people, like I said. But to your point, I mean, some of them are corporate investigators, other places. Some came from the intelligence community. We're not all from the same background. So, I mean,
Right.
that diversity in thought is also something that I really have grown to appreciate, that you don't necessarily see as much of in government as you do in the corporate world. I mean, the diversity
Absolutely.
of diversity in races, sexes, everything, but also diversity in just thought and background is really strong here, and in the corporate world.
Absolutely. And that's one thing I really appreciate is, about, especially about doing stuff like this. And I know we had a conversation before I hit record, but everyone has such a unique story, and, you know, being able to listen to podcasts like this and say, well, I never thought that anyone understood my story, but after listening to that, like, man, if he can do it or if she can do it, I think I can do that.
Oh, believe
Like
me,
that's a real,
if I can
yeah,
do it, anybody can do it, brother. I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, man. I'm not a rocket scientist. Just be patient and be humble, and that would be my advice. Is just don't get if you get told no 30 times, don't let it beat you down, man. Get 33 resumes, man. It's not 33 in before I got the nod. It's humbling.
absolutely. And, I know a lot of people who have had far more than that,
Yeah.
and so I think, the overall message is you're not alone.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who have gone before you, and there's a lot of people who will go after you. And being able to leverage their experiences and talk with them about what worked well, what didn't, and be able to leverage their relationships and their networks. It's just like in law enforcement. There's a community. That same community exists out here. It's just different. You know,
Right.
but don't think that just because you're leaving your family and you're leaving your identity, so to speak, that you can't find something similar in the private sector, because, we're all still here. we're all former law enforcement who have made the transition successfully. And, we're here to help. We're here to, bend our ear. We're here to provide advice. We're here to just listen.
Yeah.
And, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, man, I'm just discouraged right now, I don't know what to do, reach out, schedule a conversation, reach out to Pete, reach out to the other individuals who have, done podcasts, because we've all been where you are, and, we're invested in your success.
Great advice.
Absolutely. I know we're winding down, Pete, but is there any other advice or anything else that you want to say to people who might be tuning in?
No, I mean, you touched on it all. I mean, it's like I said, it's a transition. It's an experience, and you're going to have your ups, your downs. Just be patient and be persistent, and don't let the no's reduce your confidence. But yeah, to your point, build a network. If you're going to post on LinkedIn, don't post political stuff. Don't be hateful. People look. So just be positive, and good things will come your way. And look, if you're in law enforcement and you're a person who's eligible to retire and you can collect a pension, what the hell are you waiting for? A salary on top of a pension is a nice thing.
Absolutely, brother. Well, hey, Pete, I really appreciate your time with us this evening, man. I love the advice. I love your story. And I just really appreciate your servant's heart and your willingness to lend your story to those who are either in the transition process or currently considering this.
We're all in this together, brother. No, I appreciate
That's right, man.
I appreciate your passion for those making that transition and the invite. I know you've been doing this a long time, so thank you for doing it. And I did reach out to you when I was in my process, asking you a
Yes,
couple
you did.
questions. So let's put that on the table as well. But no, thanks for the invite. I appreciate it, brother.
You're welcome.
Take
Have a
care.
good night, Pete.
Bye, everybody.